Did I hear a car door, or was that you?
No, that was only my phone.
Alright, we will start, I guess. Today we're talking about who are friends. If you haven't found out yet, then I haven't done my job.
Represent for last year.
Yeah, you got your picture.
You got me shown on camera.
Here. There you go.
There we go.
We don't want to
You
see
don't want to see
on
Tracy, huh? Since there's nobody on Zoom, I don't really need it on, so it's still kind of going over. The chat's going over now. Silly screens.
That's probably good enough.
Technically,
I need
it's still on there.
more monitors. So the Declaration of Faith is what we've been talking about, and we talked about God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, Scripture, creation. We didn't really do much about justification and sanctification. We kind of talked about that with creation and the fall, and as well as resurrection and judgment. Didn't discuss baptism too much because when that was next on the list, I gave a whole sermon on that, so I figured we covered enough. So then we did the Lord's Supper, worship and prayer we did together. Then we talked about oaths and liberty of conscience and government, peace, and then first day and marriage. So basically everything that's in that Declaration of Faith is pretty much right along lines of most evangelical churches, except for maybe baptism and the Lord's Supper. But I think they explained it fairly well. So today, what happens after this? They declared their faith, and that's when things get a little more exciting. So this began to unify their testimony as a unified organization. And that's important for several reasons. The first is, prior to this, every meeting and every yearly meeting had their own positions on a lot of, and own practices on a lot of things. And the meetings largely reflected who participated in them. So there wasn't any overarching, this is what Friends believe. There still isn't a whole lot of overarching, this is what Friends believe. But it was even worse then, because it could be all over the place. And at this time, there was a lot of religious and spiritual exploration. So the Seventh-day Adventists started around that time. Jehovah's Witness and Mormons all started around that time. The spiritist movement was going on at that time. So there's just all these different ideas coming in together. And depending on where you lived, your friend's church might be Mormon, or it might be Jehovah's Witness, or it might be spiritualist, or it could be Christian, Orthodox Friends, or it could be
Nudist.
I mean, that, and Shakers came out of that movement, and just a lot of different groups. So now that they have this unifying Declaration of Faith, people now had some general idea as to what Friends believed, the large majority of Friends. And then this opened the door for a united ministries. So if we're all believe the same thing, then we can pool our resources to do various ministries. And a lot of those ministries were building schools, ministering to Native Americans on the reservations and stuff like that. Something that one meeting couldn't really do by themselves. So, Friends University, where I got my master's degree came out of this movement. So, because they were highly concerned with educating the population and allowing for inexpensive or free education for most people. So, someone come in?
I heard a thump outside.
I'll check.
It's alright.
So-
They won't come in.
The time frame here, the Gurneyite influenced yearly meetings met in September of 1887. That's when the Declaration was formulated and signed. But there's a lot of other things going on in America at that time. There was a great deal of, my mouse does not want to stay where there's technological advances, political reforms, and a lot of social shifting. So these are a few of the things that happened at that time. So, steel industry exploded during that time frame. Railroads were going across the continent. The first transcontinental railroad was finished in 1867 or something like that.
Yeah.
So after that happened, then little smaller local branches were starting to build railroads all over the place. And that was very important. Electricity was first coming out. So we have Tesla and Edison and all that. The telephone was first emerging. Labor unions and labor riots were going on at steel plants and mining companies and railroads. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. There's a presidential assassination. Red Cross was formed. Sitting Bull surrenders, so that ended the Indian Wars. The OK Corral incident happened. Interstate Commerce Act was passed. And then there's the Darwinism and social Darwinism was very big. So the monkey trial was going on in this general time frame, and out of that came the pseudoscience of social Darwinism, which a lot of our racial history and understanding of race comes from, which kind of ties into the Chinese Exclusion Act as well. So this time frame, the 1880s, was pretty busy. The Civil War ended, so they're reconstructing, and that's why there's a lot of railroads and steel and all that going on, and mining.
Yeah, Reconstruction technically ended as a government thing in 1870,
So they're done with that.
but it continued on as a economic and industrial force for another 20 years after that.
Yeah. So then there's also a great push to fill the lands in between the coasts. And a lot of those acts started prior to the Civil War, but there's even greater push as railroads went into those areas.
The Union Pacific, for every mile of track they laid west from Omaha, received 4,000 acres of land, 2,000 on either side of the track. That they could sell. And they built towns and they sold land, so there would be agriculture, so their railroad would have something to haul.
So the Standard Oil was coming out at that time as well. So transporting oil from Texas and other areas that were
Yeah, that
emerging.
would be the very early days of the
So
Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas oil boom.
so the railroad companies were growing throughout the nation, but they were also slowing down towards the 1880s because they're getting saturated. And as that started slowing a little bit, then immigration was becoming an issue because now you have a bunch of people that used to have jobs and now they're in our communities looking for jobs. Does it sound like anything that we're hearing in the news at all? And that's when they started writing the first immigration laws. So a lot of people in social media will say all the immigrants came to Ellis Island and they looked at the Statue of Liberty and all that. The Statue of Liberty wasn't there yet. So I think it was 1887 when the Statue of Liberty was received, or something right around that, towards this time frame they received
It was supposedly a gift for the centennial, but it didn't arrive on time. It actually, they built it in Paris and then took it back apart and then shipped it in. Arrived sometime on a ship in the early 1880s.
But it wasn't put up until late
But then they-
1880s.
Yeah, then they had to raise enough money to build someplace to put it.
So all immigration was going on prior to that, and the Chinese immigrants that they made that first immigration law with didn't come to New York from China. They came to San Francisco or one of the ports on the West Coast.
Or the, well, like my mom's side of the family came into Galveston, or well, part of them came in Galveston, part of them came into New Orleans, and they wound up in, one came this way, and the other family came this way. Wound up in East Texas.
My family came in North Carolina, so
I know, literature-wise, stuff like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Mysterious Island were just coming out shortly after that. Stuff set in the Civil War time. That was a sci-fi at the time.
yeah. So even though there's a lot of, it looks like the economy's strong at that time with railroads going up everywhere and mining and oil, the 1880s were actually in a recession.
First made use of heavy tariffs to protect American industrial complex.
So 1880 or 1873 to 1879 is referred to as the Long Depression, and some people will say that it actually went to 1896 because there were back-to-back recessions with like one quarter where there's growth in between. So you have a lot of people in small communities moving west, and there's a reason why OK Corral happened, why Jesse James robbed banks, why, because there was a lot of poor, and a lot of people blame railroads and banks for their problems, kind of like the 30s. So the railroads were cutting wages, and that led to strikes, as well as the steel industry. And there wasn't a whole lot to do because this is before the antitrust laws were passed. So you either took what they gave or you starve. You starved anyway, but at least you had a job. And, company towns and stuff like that were emerging where everything was owned by the company and you basically were in debt to your job. And the U.S. returned to the gold standard at this time after they went off of it during the Civil War. And a lot of people think that caused the recession because they didn't actively remove currency as much as they should have. So a lot of people were trying to get gold and there wasn't gold to be had. And then the depressed economy encouraged a lot of progressive movements and social concerns. So it might surprise you that Kansas used to be one of the more progressive states because they faced a lot of the economic hardships that the railroad companies were causing because of the high freight costs of agricultural goods. So they were spending most of their income and profits, or most of the income from selling the wheat, they were spending on paying for transport. And didn't have a whole lot left. So a lot of the more progressive aspects of our government came out of places like Kansas.
Well, this is the start of the women's suffrage movement for the most part. A lot of the formalization, like you said earlier, of the Red Cross and the various other aid societies. The Kansas City was, I forget which of the hospitals in town traces its roots to development during this time as a place for health care for the poor that lived on in the West Bottoms of that.
Yeah.
And in the North Bottoms, as far as that goes.
And people like Johns Hopkins, owned a railroad company, tried to take care of his people. Of course, he was very wealthy and he started hospitals as well. A hospital in college as well.
Carnegie start his big?
It was around this time, but this time he was still active in the company because it was before the labor or during the labor strikes and the Pinkertons and all of that. So, and this era is commonly regarded in history as the robber baron era. So, the reason I bring this up is because of the parallels in our current history and how the church handled what was going on in their time frame. So because of all this, all the migration of people from the eastern area into the west and the Midwest and far west, there's a lot of population shifting. There's immigration concerns, there's financial concerns, and a lot of this is things that one meeting can't do for themselves. So then they started thinking, we need to have something that unifies all of us. And that's where the need for the unified discipline came from. And so, as the immigrants or migrants, not just immigrants, were settling in areas that were once sparsely inhabited or on reservations, land that was once reserved for Native Americans, they may have come from a type of church in the East, and they didn't know what the ones locally believed. So they wanted that unified discipline. So if you came from Ohio into Kansas, this is what the Friends churches here believe. Or if you go into California, this is what the Friends churches or meetings believe. So, and that kind of gave, you'd know that they were similar to the ones that you left. And as the social concerns and ministry opportunities presented themselves, a unified discipline allowed common ministry work. So, like I said, John Hopkins started his hospital prior to this, but that's the general idea. So a lot of people saw what he was doing and they pooled their resources. All the schools west of the Mississippi that Friends started were at this time. We need to educate people in these areas so that they can have a better life. So hopefully they don't have to rely on, the mining industry to stay active, or the gold industry or silver industry or railroads. We want to keep them in our communities and grow. So education was big, and they pooled their resources to do that. And I think Friends University started in 1893, so that's very much part of what this is. And the acceptance of the Declaration of Faith encouraged the yearly meetings to come together to form the 5 years meeting in 1902. So as they were discussing this Declaration of Faith, they decided, let's revisit things every 5 years. And they formed that 5 years meeting in 1902, and it was later changed to Friends United meeting in 1966. It's a great name, 5 years meeting. Why didn't we keep that? Grammar check constantly wanted me to change it to 5 year meeting, but it is the 5 years meeting. So the first schism of American Friends occurred in the 1820s, and it was largely over social concerns and how to interact with government and the population, as well as theological interpretations. The 1830s and 40s, the Orthodox Friends divide occurred, and those that followed Wilbur were on one side, John Wilbur, and then Joseph John Gurney was on the other. The Wilburites were more Christocentric than the Hicksites and held traditional Friends practices, where the Gurneyites were more theological, focused on education more, and were evangelically focused. So you can kind of get an idea of where we fall in that. The Gurneyite meetings were those that promoted the Declaration of Faith, and their main focus was establishing Sunday schools, educational missions, and they participated in Bible societies. Gurney was very much a part of the American Bible Society and the British Bible Society. So the Gurneyite yearly meetings were the ones that were largely participating in the Western expansion. So that's why they are more active in this area. Mount Air Friends, where I grew up, was started by the Gregory family, and the purpose of establishing that area was to have a Christian community, and where people could live together in a friendly manner. And although the community doesn't identify as Friends, the first post office for my hometown was at the Gregory General Store, which is kind of interesting. It's because they had the structure because they came to build community instead of just to get rich quick.
It's interesting. I was just reading a set of articles on the Quaker response to the potato famine. And about, 3 years into the potato famine, 3.5, something like that, the British government had decided that it was too much of a burden, it was too much bad press, so they declared that it was over. And they shut down, to save money, they shut down all the soup kitchens that they had been running. And it was the Quakers stepped in and ran it for another 8 years.
That's interesting.
Do we get to animate a nervous tick thing face going on there?
Well, I mean, that's a very governmental thing to do. We don't want to deal with this anymore, so it no longer exists.
So these western areas, since there weren't as many people or established churches, a lot of people started attending the Friends churches or meetings, and they weren't accustomed to the Friends traditions. So the Gurneyite meetings began to release recorded ministries to serve as educators and pastors. And these pastors weren't the head of the meeting, the clerk still remained that, but their role was to provide spiritual guidance to the members. And that eventually evolved into program services or semi-program services that we have today, at least here. But that came from the need of education in the communities and just teaching people how to be friends. It wasn't necessarily that we wanted clergy, it's just, it was a need. So they answered the need by paying people to provide that. They still don't pay very much. So what yearly meetings comprise the 5-year meeting? We had New York yearly meeting, which was established in 1695. New England yearly meeting, 1661. Baltimore yearly meeting in 1672. North Carolina in the 1680s. And then you start getting into the Western expansion, 1821 for Indiana. Notice the big gap in years there. Western yearly meeting, which is also in Indiana, is 1858. Iowa yearly meeting in 1863. Kansas yearly meeting in 1872. Wilmington yearly meeting in 1892, which is also in Indiana and Kentucky. That's the mission into Appalachia. And then Oregon yearly meeting in 1893 and California in 1895. So I just found it really interesting at how big of a gap the yearly meetings establishment was.
I noticed that the Indiana was right around that schism, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a reason for that, yeah. Which I think we covered that at one
Yeah, we did at one point. So, but yeah, that schism was very fundamental in the formation of Indiana yearly meeting, because they had to try to. It was one of the mission points of Baltimore yearly meeting, and Baltimore was basically broken in half. So, and then Canada yearly meeting joined in 1907. So that's the 12, what they consider the 12 founding yearly meetings of the 5 years meeting.
It's interesting that there's no mention of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or there was another large one. It was guess I might be into the New York yearly meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, Philadelphia was one that was large, or that was hit pretty hard with the Hicksite schism, as well as the Wilburite schism.
There were big lawsuits over who could control the church.
So
who got the church building? Yeah, it was quite a mess.
I know you've said that Quakerism is more popular in Africa than it is in the Americas.
mhm.
When did Friends' popularity start growing in Africa?
They started missions there fairly early, but it was more in the coastal regions. It was a 5 years meeting that really encouraged them to do that, to go into areas like Kenya and do missions.
Okay.
So it's shortly after this. And Kansas Yearly Meeting started their mission work in Burundi during the Great Depression. So a lot of that mission work began around the same time. So, and that's all across evangelical Christianity, not just Quakers. That was a big movement during that time frame. So meetings that participated but didn't join, Ohio Yearly Meeting. I mentioned that the Gregories moved from North Carolina to Ohio, and friends from Ohio moved to Kansas City area to do the Shawnee mission. And so Ohio is definitely part of our history, but they weren't part of the 5 years meeting. And that was, you probably weren't here for that, but that was because they were largely influenced by the Beaconite movement, which was getting away from the mystical side of Quakerism and more into the evangelical side, and kind of more of a secessionist of spiritual gifts. And out of that was a lot of the Darby movement with eschatology, where the rapture and left behind and all that eschatology of end times came about as well, which plays into the Millerites, which formed the Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses were all part of that movement of eschatology, because it's kind of near the turn of the century, so obviously Jesus is going to return at 1900 or something like that, and we're going to escape all that prior to that. So
1812 had a certain war going on at the same time.
yeah, Ohio 1812, and Ohio Yearly Meeting was largely founded by Quakers fleeing from North Carolina to get away from slavery. So they had entire meetings move as a group to Ohio so that they could, and Ohio Yearly Meeting also had the coffees. So Levi Coffin was from Ohio, and a lot of the abolitionist movement came through Ohio.
People think of Ohio being settled earlier than it really was.
Yeah.
Even in 1812, there wasn't that much in Ohio. It was pretty much strung out in a little strip along the river.
Yeah,
There wasn't much inland.
It was frontier still. And Northwest Territories, which Indiana and all that was.
Even though they like to think of themselves as less, they really are.
And then as the Trail of Tears and all that happened, they started moving on farther past the Northwest Territories. So the most of the yearly meetings that joined the 5 years meeting were established by a Baltimore yearly meeting, although some of them were from North Carolina fleeing slavery. Kansas yearly meeting was founded by members that provided education to Native Americans and came from Ohio and other yearly meetings, but their administrative direction came from Indiana. So a lot of the historical books will say that it's a mission point of Indiana yearly meeting, although it is really a mission point of Ohio. So this is late 1800s, early 1900s. What happened shortly after that?
Like in 1920 was the Roaring Twenties.
I was thinking the invention of flight.
Yeah, that's part of it. There's a war that happened in Europe.
Yeah, 1910.
Well, first we had a little one with Spain.
Yeah. But we're jumping up to World War One because that's the build up to the next schism. So Friends had lived through various wars, and they have this peace testimony. So we didn't really. Some did participate in the Civil War, and they were written out of the meetings because they participated in war, where others refused to participate in war and struggled. But the Great War offered different challenges. It was a war that was being fought in Europe, not in our backyard. We weren't directly affected by it, so it had different feels. So it's one way to say I don't want to fight, even though there's fighting going on all around you. There is it's hard to not participate, but people can still respect your position because you're still living there. When the whole nation's at war and you're refusing to participate, then it becomes political. So the United States joined World War I, and they established a draft. And many Friends holding to the peace testimony were facing social dilemmas. There's an estimated that 16,000 men registered as conscientious objectors. Many of them were Quakers, and 6,000 of them were imprisoned for refusing to go to service. To me, that sounds kind of low. But
Also,
Well, considering the draft was about 2.5 million
yeah,
and about 2-ish million volunteers.
yeah,
movies were just starting to become a thing back then too.
Yeah.
That technology was just starting.
yeah,
Well, wasn't George Fox in prison for refusing to?
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It just, to me, it seems like the numbers are very low for conscientious objectors.
It wasn't something they were actively. It depended a lot. Well, one, who got charged was highly dependent because of the way local draft boards were set up. So if you're in a strongly a community with a strong Quaker presence, not even a majority, but just or Mennonite, Amish, various other sects who were doing the same thing at the time, the probability of the local draft board taking the political dangerous step of prosecuting you for being a conscientious objector was low.
Yeah,
I think if you looked at those, you would find those happening in New York and the larger cities back east.
Yeah.
Chicago perhaps, St. Louis perhaps, but doubtful in Kansas City.
Yeah.
I know personally, until about 1960, mid-60s, late 60s, 68 or so, the chances of a white person from Wyandotte County being drafted was about 15%, that of a black person from Wyandotte County being drafted.
That's crazy. So there is a PBS actually did a story on one of the communities that face this. I don't remember which PBS station it was, but I watched it a couple years ago. But basically, the entire male population of that Friends meeting was jailed during World War I. So when World War II broke out, that entire community moved to Costa Rica to avoid being drafted. And they have established a very nice community down there and have a very highly regarded school. But they went to Costa Rica because at that time Costa Rica disbanded their military. So they felt like they wouldn't be asked to fight again. So luckily it's worked out well for them. So they have this problem of the draft. How can you serve your country without fighting? And that's what formed the American Friends Service Committee. It was founded in 1917 in Philadelphia, actually. So this brings back Philadelphia yearly meeting. They're not part of the 5 years meeting, but we're still working with them. They founded the American Friends Service Committee in response to the urgent need for conscientious objectors to find alternatives to military service. And they provided spiritual guidance and moral support for the conscientious objectors that found themselves forced to serve.
And we're still talking World War I stuff.
Yeah.
Right after World War I stuff.
Right during World War I.
Because Americans didn't enter the war till
Late.
the last 2 years of it.
Right, and I just know that conscientious objectors were often offered the ability to be test subjects for experiments in World War II.
Yeah. So they also organized the collection of relief aid for displaced people on both sides of the war. And along with similar organizations in Europe, they provided medical care for the injured people, both civilian and military, and again for both sides of the war. And they also provided assistance for areas affected by the Spanish flu. And it's called the Spanish flu because Spain wasn't involved in World War I, so they reported the flu, where America kept it secret, even though probably more people died of that than the war itself. And it started in Kansas, so it should be the Fort Riley flu, not the Spanish flu. So when the Great War ended, the American Friends Service Committee continued to work in France, Russia, Serbia, Poland, Germany, and Austria, and as well as other areas of Europe. They continued to provide assistance to refugees, and they assisted in rebuilding homes and farms in the war-torn areas. So they didn't just leave after the war, they stayed. And important people, Rufus Jones was born in 1883 and died in 1948. He was a Quaker historian, a theologian, and the co-founder of American Friends Service Committee and the first chairman. Another co-founder, Henry J. Cadbury, You might recognize that name because Quakers were large in the chocolate industry as well, especially holiday themed chocolates that they didn't participate in but they liked to profit off of. He was also a co-founder and he became the second chairman. And then later on, an active member of the American Friends Service Committee was Bayard Rustin. He is an African American Quaker that helped organize the March on Washington. We don't hear a lot about him because of other aspects of his life, but he's an important figure. So after the war, they also continued in other areas. In 1924, they published a pamphlet called Exclusion, Its Cause and Cure. It's a pamphlet that outlined the roots of racism and noted the contributions of immigrants in the U.S. economy. And in 1927, they hired Crystal Bird, a young black woman, and they sent her around the United States to speak about racial equality and attempted to bridge the racial divide and to stop lynching, which was a very big problem. And our stance on capital punishment comes directly from that. And she promoted integration of public schools and equality in jobs and housing. And then in the 30s, they assisted Jewish refugees to flee Germany. They provided assistance in resettlement, and they spoke on their behalf to the government. And a few months ago, I did show a video about that as well. About 22,000 Jewish refugees were directly assisted by American Friends Service Committee, which again sounds kind of low, but Friends aren't very big. The amount of Friends population-wise in the United States versus how much they helped, it's actually surprising. Because they didn't just, they helped establish them in the communities, finding them jobs and making sure they had a place to live. So it was a huge investment. So then they continued into World War II, where they stood in opposition to Japanese internment. Again, the pamphlet that they talked about that they wrote in the 2024 was largely about Japanese immigrants and the Chinese Exclusion Act and stuff like that. They provided assistance to incarcerated individuals that couldn't afford representation. This goes back to that Bird and her work against lynching. So they tried to come into those areas where the poor and the people of color were being charged with crimes that they may or may not have committed, and they provided legal representation to them. And they continued to provide aid to communities that were affected by war. So they were active in Europe during World War II as well. And in 1947, AFSC, along with the British Friends Service Council, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of all Quakers worldwide for their pioneering work in international peace movement and compassionate efforts to relieve human suffering. And I believe we were the first religious organization to get the Peace Prize. I think the second was Mother Teresa. So this brings us to Ruford Jones. He grew up in South China, Maine. found that to be an interesting name for a town in Maine. Especially in 1863. So he'd be part of New England Yearly Meeting. And then he moved to Pennsylvania, and he attended Haverford College, and he got a master's degree there as well as his undergraduate degree. And in 1893, he became the editor of Friends Review, which later became the American Friend. And while he is the editor, he tried to bring unity back into the yearly meetings. So he is trying to work with the Hicksites as well as the 5 years meeting, trying to bring them back together. And in 1901, he received a master's degree from Harvard. So he's not just some... He went to good schools at that time, and he taught philosophy and psychology at Haverford from 1893 to 1934. And he served on the board of Bryn Mawr.
One of the seven sisters.
Yeah. So, which is a women's college. So
It's not anymore.
it was then.
It was then.
So it's again, you can see the equality aspect, testimony in what he worked in. So as he helped form the American Friends Service Committee in 1917, and from that work, the YMCA asked him to join them on a trip throughout Asia in 1927, where he met with Gandhi and others. And after that trip, it changed his focus in mission of American Friends Service Committee to provide humanitarian aid while respecting various cultures and religions, which is why some of that is why a lot of Evangelical Friends don't support American Friends Service Committee. They think they're not being very Christian because they're not trying to convert everybody. He worked diligently to bring unity among friends and was active in the 5 years meeting. And that's the part that's important about him. He was very active. He is very famous. He wrote several books, so many books that I couldn't count them without losing count. So I didn't include how many books, because it was like three pages on the website of his book list. We do have some of his books in our library if you wanted to read them. And he was a very influential figure in American universities. So he was on a traveling circuit, visiting universities, talking about philosophy and psychology, which is interesting. So back to the 5 years meeting. There is a growing desire among several of the yearly meetings within the 5 years meeting to take a more fundamentalist approach to theology. Again, you have this, if you remember what's going on at this time, Darwinism's becoming more popular. And from Darwinism, there's this critical, and the scriptures being looked at more critically and historically, and what is true in scripture and what isn't true in scripture, and can we prove it historically, and that sort of thing. So, and as that was coming out, the fundamentalist movement was trying to push back, and that's was going on in the Friends Church as well. So in 1926, Oregon Yearly Meeting withdrew from the 5 years meeting because they were concerned with the emerging liberal theology that was prominent in religious academia. Again, it sounds like current events if you really think about it. So Oregon was the first to pull away. And then in 1947, several of the early meetings and unassociated monthly meetings formed the Association of Evangelical Friends. And if you think about 30s and 40s in European history, what else was going on?
World War II.
The buildup of World War II, all through, that's liberal theology was very big in Germany, and that's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke out against. And so this isn't just something that was in France, it's the entire church. So this organization was founded by fundamentalist-minded Quakers, and those that were involved were Northwest Yearly Meeting, which was Oregon Yearly Meeting at that time, Mid-America Yearly Meeting, which is Kansas Yearly Meeting.
Is that ours?
That's
That's the one we're associated yet.
Okay.
Southwest Yearly Meeting, which was California. Rocky Mountain Yearly Meeting, which this is one of the unassociated monthly meetings. They pulled out of Nebraska Yearly Meeting, which is now called Great Plains Yearly Meeting, because of that sort of evangelical mindedness, and they eventually formed their own yearly meeting and joined with the Association of Evangelical
Kind of a
Friends.
yearly meeting.
Yeah, they have not ever been really big. And then Alaska Yearly Meeting was it's a mission point of California Yearly Meeting. It's not, they call it a yearly meeting. I don't know if it's really functional. So they do have churches, but it's almost only a name.
Much sparser than ours
Yeah.
here.
But per capita, Evangelical Friends is the largest non-Orthodox church in Alaska. There's only like 3 churches. So and then the interesting one is Ohio Yearly Meeting, which became Evangelical Church Eastern Region, joined the Association of Evangelical Friends, even though they didn't join the 5 years meeting. So that was interesting. And they didn't sign the Declaration of Faith either, so it's interesting that they brought them in. So David's looking up something very
Well, I'm curious. There's Anchorage,
Speaking of which,
Kotzebue,
what was that?
Nonotac, Kiana, and another one in and Deering, and in Alaska. So that's
It's almost bigger than Rocky Mountain, to be
1,
honest.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There may be 2 churches in Anchorage, so there might be 6.
Man, they're high rollers there. In 1965, the name was changed to the Evangelical Friends Alliance.
website.
In 1989, it was changed to Evangelical Friends International. And in 2004, it was changed to Evangelical Friends Church International. We like to change names.
Yeah, we just had a discussion about it at the yearly meeting. Board of Elders were changing our names, and they're going, "Oh, maybe we should change it a little bit, and then in a few years we'll change it a little bit again." It's like, just pick a name and stick with it.
Well, I can see that there are some significant gaps there, like 24
I can't help but
years.
think of, what are our names?
Our name now is
No. What are our nouns?
Nouns. Oh.
Instead of one of our pronouns, what are our nouns?
Yeah.
I'm just, that's,
The new name that's going to be presented but not acted upon at yearly meeting is
I mean, the whole thing's.
Friends Mid-America.
I'm cool with that.
Can I pronounce it?
Yep.
If
FMA.
just for purposes of being able to talk with somebody about it, being able to pronounce it's kind of a prerequisite.
The only problem with the proposed name is when you type it, it autocorrects to FMLA.
the
Family
loss.
Medical Leave Act.
Well, FML also means form loss too.
Yeah. So EFCI, Evangelical Friends Church International, has various regions around the world. They all go by the name currently Evangelical Friends Church, and then the hyphen Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and North America. And all of the regions have to agree before they change anything in their constitution. So, which is funny. And we're part of Evangelical Friends International because we're part of Evangelical Friends Church Mid-America. Hence why we want to change our name. It's hard to say all these. And we're part of Evangelical Friends Church North America. So all the yearly meetings in North America meet together, supposedly.
Coming up in a few weeks is
And
the next big meeting. It's all the superintendents of the yearly meetings get together and have a meeting. And sometimes they do things that Jared and I complain about.
so these 6 yearly meetings, they partner with evangelically minded yearly meetings. So we do work with some of the meetings that are still part of Friends United meeting, like Iowa and Indiana and North Carolina. And we also work with outside organizations, outside of Friends. So the E-Free Church, we have a fairly good relationship with. The Mennonite, various Mennonite groups we have a good relationship with as well. And they allow us to participate in their Mennonite mutual aid and
The
events.
insurance on the church and Jared's workers' comp insurance are approved by Mennonite Insurance Group Mutual Company.
So
Mennonite Mutual.
yeah, they do work with us quite well, and it's because we partner with people that believe similar things, and that goes back to our historical roots. You know, if you're not against us, we'll work with you, and it also goes with our evangelical roots, where we want to be as Christ-centered as possible. So the EFCI meetings are more likely to refer to their monthly meetings as churches instead of monthly meetings. Hence, I sometimes go back and forth. And
I think we should be meetings.
by and large, they all have either a semi-programmed or programmed meeting for worship. And the difference between programmed and semi-programmed is programmed, they have very little to no silent open worship time, and the semi-programmed you'd have a larger open worship time.
To me, it makes more sense to call it a church just for those who are not.
Yes. Which is why I tend to flip.
Because if you call it a meeting, they have other ideas.
Yeah.
Well, do you understand the roots of that though? The term meeting?
I heard at some point, but go ahead.
When the Church of England was the recognized church of state, it was illegal to create another church. So they could not build a church and call it a church. So, or they would meet in someone's house And when they got more prosperous and larger and created their own little communities, or became enough of a majority that they had enough political clout in the area, they would build a meeting house, not a church. This was not just Quakers. This was true of Presbyterians. The original old churches in Scotland and northern part of Ireland that were Presbyterian, they were Presbyterian meeting houses, not churches. Now, they used those transferred over to calling them churches sooner than the Quakers did. The Quakers held on to it longer, but technically, what was important was the meeting of the group, not the building we were in. And they define those two by, that's a church building or a meeting. And this is the house that we have meetings in. So,
Yeah, that makes sense,
Yeah, I like the term monthly meeting and meeting house, so I tend to use it more frequently because I like our history.
As you said, though, for purposes of understanding, it
Yeah,
could be easier.
outsiders, yeah.
Yeah,
well, it was
and
just,
that's
But then
that's
that's
very
more-
much why the more Western yearly meetings have pastors, is because there wasn't other churches, so they had the educator there as well. So it makes sense, and there's a historic progression to that. So it does make sense that the more Western groups of friends took on the name church.
the whole name change thing that was, there's been several debates, and they keep bringing up, do we want to be Friends Mid-America? Or do we want to be Friends Church Mid-America? Or do we want to be Evangelical Friends Mid-America? And it's like, and the people are going, well, people don't realize what friends are, so we need to stick church in there. And they're going, well, we're evangelical, and I'm going, no, I don't think right now you want that word first.
What just occurred to me is a double meaning of the phrase "Friends of Mid-America."
Yeah, yeah. Which Friends of Lawrence
The original group was called Religious
church
Society of
plant
Friends,
that was
right?
trying to go into.
Yes, that is the official,
Original.
one of the official early names.
Yeah, that's what they organized under in America, at least. So the Evangelical Friends Church International does hold to the same testimonies established by the Richmond Declaration of Faith, but they're less strict than some of them. And we're also less rigid on the use of baptism and the elements, which is why Ohio Yearly Meeting didn't join, because they used those because of the influence of the Beaconites. So, and they're the ones that would go by programmed more than semi-programmed, because they have very little, if any, open worship time.
I think you misspelled rigid.
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
That's ridged.
Well, we're less ridged too. We're on the plains.
We are, yes, true.
So, if we look at what was the reason for that split, if we look at historical schisms, if you look at it now and look at the 5 years meeting, which became the FUM, and those of the Evangelical Friends Church, just looking from the outside looking in, you wouldn't see a difference.
There have been and still are in multiple areas churches that are members of both groups. We had one in our yearly meeting
Yeah,
until a couple of years ago when
they had
who
to
shall not
choose.
be named got a burr in the saddle and told them they had to choose between the two, so they said, oh, we'll be fun then.
Yeah. The interesting note The majority of the staff members of FUM have been associated with EFC at some point in their ministry. In fact, all of the major leaders in FUM were either from Friends Missions or from a branch of the EFCI.
I really don't understand why we can't get ourselves back together again.
So the
It does
main
bring up previous conversations we've had about how several religions at one point definitely had major differences, but at some point they, this is right over here. Let's get back to those roots on that, on several branches in a bit. Now, certain ones, there is notably less difference than there used to be.
Yeah. Yeah, if you were to walk into a
That's different than saying that
Oriental
there's no difference
Orthodox
between
church
religions, but
or an Eastern Orthodox church, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, yet they aren't in communion. So, Catholic and Orthodox, you could see the difference a little more, but still.
that's still different than saying that there's no difference between any religion in the world.
Yeah.
As opposed to, there's a lot less difference between these two groups than there used to be.
And the various Baptist denominations, you wouldn't see the difference.
To tell the truth, if you get anywhere towards the slightly liberal form of Episcopalianism and Lutherans, they are interchangeable.
And they are in communion with one another.
Yeah.
If you were a member of a Lutheran church, you can join the
As long as it's
Episcopalian.
not Missouri or Wisconsin Senate.
Yep. So the main division was this idea of fundamentalism. So the divide between liberal theology and fundamentalist theology was what started the split, and that's what remains the split. And since FUM was largely focused on academics at the time, they were starting universities, they were doing missions with education and that sort of thing. It was largely viewed to be liberal, even though they really aren't liberal in the sense of the theology. They were liberal. All Friends are more liberal than Baptists, but we aren't as liberal as some of the others. So,
Since Friends are so sparse in the U.S., is this more of a regional thing, or are there members of FUM in the Kansas City area?
the closest FUM church is in Wichita. In Kansas City, we do have a Wilburite church, which is the other schism. They started during the Vietnam era, so they weren't really affiliated with anybody until more recently, but they are a member of Iowa Conservative Yearly Meeting now, I think. So
They have a, like you said, they came about in the 60s. In the early days of that, it was a lot of people going to school at UMKC and the Kansas City Art Institute. There's a reason their building is on Gillum Avenue, very near those two higher education things, and they were distinctly had a very strong, what was referred to in the time, the hippie element to them. And they have through the years wandered to very eastern, and wandered back, and then wandered there, and then wandered there. It all depends. If you look at them over the years, they wandered depending on who was the clerk of their meeting, and how were they leaning. Which is really interesting because less than a quarter of a mile from them is the Unitarian Church that sits up literally next to Kansas City Art Institute,
yeah.
which I like a friend of mine whose son, when he was like 10 or so, was talking to him, and they attended there, and I go, well, do you like going to church? And he goes, yeah, it's a lot like the books I like to read, where you pick what's going to happen next. It's kind of like, pick your own storybooks, and only it's a kind of pick your own religion. Because they would literally announce, those that are interested in the talk today on Buddhism, go to room this. Those that are interested in this, go to this room over here. Those that are interested in this, go to the room over here.
So,
and that was in the.
Well, I'm a fan of choose your adventure books. That doesn't sound like the kind of religion I'd want to.
Yeah. Well, I'm familiar with a bunch of the people that go there because that's where the folk dance in Kansas City was. The were needed and stuff.
So Rufus Jones was active in academics as well as the 5 Years meeting, and he is well known throughout the world for his work with the American Friends Service Committee. So he became this figurehead of American Quakerism. And his writings on the mystical aspects of Friends fueled a greater dissension as he was seen to give greater authority to the inner light or the inward light instead of Scripture. So that fueled that division between fundamentalist and liberal theology. And then this division is seen in many religious groups throughout the world, which has prompted the emergence of the Trinitarian incarnational theology, which was championed by Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So both of them were also very active, and they didn't like fundamentalism, but they didn't like liberal theology either. So
Where
they
have I heard Dietrich Bonhoeffer before?
he was the evangelical martyr in Germany that died for, they say he died for his faith. He actually died because he tried to kill Hitler.
He's very active in getting Jews and other minority or suspect groups, as the Germans referred to them, which were gays, people of color, anything like that, were
Romani.
yeah, the gypsies, the Romani, and so all those. And he worked with an organization to help get as many of them out of Germany as Hitler was rising to power.
Okay.
And he also started the Confessing Church movement, which opposed the German church. So, but both of them had similar arguments about about the liberal theology. And if you were to look at most evangelical friends, they side more with Bonhoeffer and Barth than they do fundamentalist, because we're not fundamentalist either. But we're more like the fundamentalists than the liberal theologians. So when I read Barth and Bonhoeffer, I see Quakerism through the whole thing, where others see Lutheranism or something like that. But that's just what I see. So from the history, we can learn that the Hicksite schism, one famous Quaker led the movement, and those that agreed with him stayed loyal to him, and they divided. Same with the Wilburite and Gurneyite schism, two very prominent teachers and ministers traveling throughout Quaker spaces were teaching, and those that agreed with one stayed with him, and the others eventually, it just caused a division. Same could be said with FUM and EFI. There's this famous figure that dominated the discussion and was seen as being liberal, even though if you read his writings, he's not liberal. He's more spiritual than Barth. he's pretty much right along with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but he's seen as liberal, and that fueled the split. So, and what can we learn from all that? When we get to a point where we can no longer listen to each other and become champions of one interpretation over another, chances are we need to take a step back and see what this is actually doing, because it's going to lead to a split. And if we do that without seeing the validity of the interpretation of the other group, then we're just going to divide. And this cycle continues throughout all of EFM and FUM, as well as Friends General Conference, even the group that is mostly Hicksite. So I have good grammar too, both. There's 3. So I later added FGC, but yeah, there has been additional splits within church yearly meetings of EFI, and different yearly meetings within FUM have broken off. Indiana yearly meetings no longer part of FUM. They're not part of VFC either, but they're just kind of in the ether right now, their own thing. North Carolina also split, and part of them stayed with FUM, part of them are just out. And
Northwest kind of did that same thing.
yeah, Northwest split, and they're part of it stayed with the FC, and the one that split away is independent right now. So it's I think we need to learn from our history a little bit, and we'll get into other areas of where splits occurred in EFCI that could have been a lot more detrimental than they were, because EFI has their famous figureheads as well. Richard Foster is a famous EFI figurehead, the one that wrote Celebration of Disciplines. He taught for years at Friends University. He lives in California, and he's famous all over the world. And he recognized what was going on in these various splits, because he lived through the last one, and he took a step back. He is just a Quaker, a Friends pastor. He isn't involved in all the boards, even though they want him to be involved because it brings credibility to us as an organization. He chose not to.
We're gonna have to start getting biblical. I'm glad I wasn't by that guy or that guy.
There's very much that type of feel to it. And then there's the Vineyard organization broke away from EFCI as well. So we don't hear much about that, but it broke away from Evangelical Friends. So, and both of those are very important, and we could have handled them a lot better. And if we aren't willing to learn from that history, then we're going to see more splits, because as we look at all the history of America at the time of the formation of the 5 Years meeting, it's repeating. Everything in that list is something that's currently going on right now. And we do have a choice to make. So anyway, if you would like more information about American Friends Service Committee and their history, there's a really good video. It's called Quakers, That of God, and Everyone. It goes into the history of Friends up to the formation of American Friends Service Committee and what they've done in World War I, II, and after.
Cool.
And you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. I think it's on Amazon Prime as well. And if you don't want to watch it online, I do have a DVD. So it is a very good video. So I do. It's almost 2 hours long. Otherwise, I would have watched it here. It is worthwhile.
Since this was a lot about history, when was this particular meeting founded?
Officially,
The picture here shows 1923.
That was.
Oh, there's a picture?
That was
Yeah.
significantly
That
after.
was-
I know that was later, so before 1923.
we moved here in '57. There's a picture out there of the church that we were at, and its name was First Friends. Interesting. Actually, interesting enough, the water bill that we get is, our account name is First Friends.
So the Articles of Incorporation of the
The building
Kansas
says
City
Friends
Monthly
Church.
Meeting of Friends was on November 7th of 1887.
The picture says Friends Church, by
Yeah.
the way.
That's after they joined the Association of Evangelical Friends.
That should be easy for me to remember since that's when the Declaration of...
Yeah.
The
So
Quaker roots in the area.
I'm sorry, what was the date that was in
To
87,
He's talking about the
1887.
group of Quakers came with the Shawnee Indians from northwest Ohio, Indiana, that general area, when they were moved to Kansas in the 1840s?
Yeah,
30s,
30s,
40s?
1830s.
30s, yeah. Most famous, there's the Shawnee Mission historical site. That was the Methodist mission. Okay. The last big guy that ran it, his last name was Johnson, for which Johnson County is named. Just west of that, roughly from about the downtown Mission to about Neiman, and from Shawnee Mission Parkway-ish to the river was the area covered by Quaker Mission to the Friends. If you, Shawnee Mission Parkway at Metcalf, if you go west about 2 lights to Gibbs, and then go north about 4 blocks, you're in the area where the main Evangelical Mission was. There is a building there that's probably built on the foundations of one of the buildings of the original mission. So they show up in that area in the 1830s, 40s. And have an on-again, off-again presence. A lot of the, eventually, the Shawnee were in northern Johnson County. Or across the river, you had the Delaware, the Huron, and a few other groups from back east that had been settled in what's now Wyandotte County. Well, the Wyandotte, I forgot that.
Yeah. That's where they get the name of the county.
That's where the name of the county comes from. So those were all settled there, and then later, they were then moved to Oklahoma. After this is like, it was like separate from the Trail of Tears where they were moving the Cherokee and the Creek and the Choctaw and tried to move the Seminoles out of Georgia, Alabama, Carolinas, Florida, west to Oklahoma. Well, the Shawnee resisted longer, and when they came, they asked the Quakers that had been kind of living with them, teaching them, helping them, they asked for some of them to come with them. It wasn't like an organized thing by the government or anything, but several of them left and came out, and they're very different models between the two missions. I mean, the Methodist mission was set up as a school, and they were going to turn these Indians into Christians. And the Quakers were out here, they kind of lived with them, they taught them to farm,
They lived in community with them. Their kids went to the same school as
all the kids they had the same teachers, the same school.
So,
And when those moved, some went to Oklahoma. Not all left.
yeah. And our mission went to Oklahoma as well. We have not to the Shawnee anymore, but we do have Kickapoo
Yeah.
Indian Center as well, and they're active with the Kickapoo government as well as the church. So.
I've got to remember, I've got to be careful when asking you about it.
So, yeah, that's how we started.
He's got the added perk of allow me to monologue as a free action. Oh wait, no, right?
Our meeting
That was a bad
wasn't
joke.
part of the mission itself, but the people that retired from the mission that stayed in the area is who started Willow Creek. So,
Yeah, there's a direct kind of series of connections. There used to be a Quaker church out in the western part of Kansas City, Kansas. That ceased to be a viable meeting in the late 80s.
yeah.
Something like that, so it was shut down and the building was sold to a different church that uses it now.
We still owned it at that time. They eventually sold it to whoever started Kansas Speedway.
Jared, how long have you been pastor here?
Since 2010.
15 years. Okay.
15 years, yeah.
Been a bit now.
Yeah, but
That's a good long run for a pastor.
Well, he attended here before he became pastor here, when he was younger. He
But
was brother.
the way that Friends did missions was very different than a lot of other denominations. The Gurneyeites kind of changed that a little bit. The original missions in Kenya were more of the colonialism missions. So there is a school in Palestine that was started by FUM, still there and still functioning as a Friends school. Very good school. But it had the more traditional missions organization feel to them. And then after Jones went traveling through Asia, a lot of that philosophy changed throughout Friends, where they went back to we're going to do education and service type things more than just conversion. So our current missions in Africa and Rwanda and places like that is discipleship for development, where they are teaching them trades and giving them small loans to start businesses and that sort of thing, and how to incorporate a holistic discipleship instead of just I go to church. So it's interesting. It works fairly well, but it is
It's
it's
kind of
different.
like going back to early Friends. I mean, Friends in England became significant in business because, well, they in general, because they weren't Church of England, they weren't allowed to They went to government, they couldn't be attorneys, they couldn't be several different other varieties of, they couldn't necessarily attend college even. So they went into trades, but they got a reputation because of their straightforward and fair dealing in trade. And I find it kind of interesting that a big chunk of what Jared is just talking about is teaching them how to ethically run a business as a Christian. You treat your neighbors fairly, they will come back and buy from you.
So, yeah, it's interesting. That's why I like the history of Friends, is because they did a lot of things right. They did a lot of things wrong, but they did a lot of things right. And we were forgetting some of that as we try to be more like other churches. So
We want to be mainstream.
But next week we'll go over chapter 9 of George Fox's journal, and then I really need to learn how to do PowerPoint. Week 57 is finding answers together. So if I don't have any questions, then we'll do more of Ten Commandments, Sermon on the Mount stuff. So
Speaking of, I'm probably not going to be attending the George Fox ones anymore. I'm getting a little
overwhelmed.
drained on that.
Yeah, depending on if the guy from Mexico City continues to join, we'll probably only do a couple more chapters. So if the guy from Mexico City continues or wants to continue, I'll continue, just because he might be encouraged to seek out the churches in Mexico and become a part of that. So
If you want to